So now that we're coming back to this piece for another day of work, another day of refining, there's a good chance that the tools that we have set up um, probably aren't going to do the kind of detailed work that we eventually need. We might get one more day worth of work out of our initial popsicle stick carving here, my knife tool and the chisel tool. This was an awesome tool actually for kind of hogging away all that extra waste material. About 5 minutes into working with this tool, the one that I made out of an old piece of 2x4, it totally cracked off the tip. So I had to replace the end here, and what I ended up doing was cutting a kerf down inside the tool, fitting a new popsicle stick in, clamping it up with some epoxy in there, and once it dried, I worked the whole thing down with some sandpaper, and we'll call it try number 2. You know, oftentimes I never really know exactly how the tools are going to fare until I work with them, and I'm constantly modifying my tools as I go anyway. That's how I end up usually with a kit full of art making tools instead of just 1 or 2. Now, if we happen to have our fettling knives, we wouldn't have to be working with so many of these tools. But one of the nice things about the tools that I've been making is that they're much more detailed. The points are going to handle a lot more refined work. If you're not interested in doing any more of the kind of basic woodworking stuff, you know, an old kitchen knife, like I said in an earlier video, could totally work. Just make sure that you rough down the edge with some sandpaper. A kitchen knife is likely going to be way too sharp to work with the canvas board, let alone your fingers. So, you know, a little sandpaper over the edge of the knife literally just kind of takes the edge off so that you're not in danger of cutting yourself. If you don't have an old kitchen knife or something like that sitting around, the next best thing would probably be to make some tools, make some copper tools, for example, or I have some steel tools, tools that have been either cold forged or potentially even hot forged, depending on the gauge of the steel. Some of those tools have angled tips. Some of them are really, really fine for doing detailed work. Some of them are bigger for hogging away material. Some of them I've added wooden handles to, and others I haven't. So how would you do this kind of work? Well, it starts with something that just about every one of us has got running through the walls in our house. In the United States here, this Romex cable at either a 12 gauge or a 15 gauge Romex copper wire. If you happen to have any scrap laying around, all you have to do is get rid of some of this sheathing off the outsides, and you're left with some bare copper. And we'll take it out to the shop and work just the ends of it here. Copper's not a bad choice for this kind of work because it's very soft, very malleable kind of metal. It'll hold a kind of a nice tool edge for doing the scraping in the clay, but it's not so hard to shape. Aluminum could also potentially, if you happen to have any aluminum wire around, could also potentially make for fairly good tools, except it's pretty soft, even softer than the copper, so this may actually deform. Honestly, you know, a piece of steel could probably be the best. Something about the diameter of like a coat hanger, if you happen to have an old coat hanger, but you're going to end up having to bang away on that quite a bit more, especially if it's cold. If you have the ability to heat it up, all of these metals become much easier to shape. But since I'm going to assume that you don't have any torches at home, and at best you might have a piece of copper electrical wire laying around, let's just do that one for this demo. Chuck on some safety glasses. I'm going to use some hearing protection too. So now that I brought the copper inside, I'll talk just a little bit more about shaping the ends of these pieces. Eventually, I would be hoping to, you know, replicate the kind of chisel tip that we made out of wood. And with wood, it's a little bit easier to sand, but copper is a fairly soft material, similar to some wood, so we can also sand the copper. As I was hammering it out, I used a small anvil block. This is actually just kind of a solid bar of steel. It's really great for kind of banging away on things. I also used a flat-faced hammer. It's actually slightly rounded here, A flat-faced hammer makes sure that I'm landing all of my blows to flatten it out. There are a lot of different kind of shapes to hammers that you've got around. This is probably a pretty typical type of hammer you might find around the house, so that one is working great. If you don't have something like an anvil for striking, you could strike it against the ground. Just keep in mind that whatever texture is on the surface that you're hitting, whatever your anvil texture is, you're going to pick up that texture the same way for your hammer, right? If your hammer has any kind of a textured face to it, all of that's going to be translated to your soft material. So because copper is soft, similar to the wood that we were using, we should be able to get our piece of sandpaper back out and work down those edges. I'm going to shape this one to have the same shape as my smaller chisel tip tools. So started to knock down the edges of that tool, straighten up these sides. Maybe I'll work this tip. If you have some scrap copper around, you likely have a tool like this around. This is a cable breaker or a wire cutter. Now, this might actually help to speed up the process a little bit because I can use it to square off the tip of my chisel tool. If you don't have a cable breaker, you could just kind of keep sanding that tip and it would eventually come down. If you happen to have one though, I'll put a light crimp in the copper. I'm going to try to make this perpendicular to the face of the chisel, and that will sort of remove any sort of scrap copper bits that would have been getting in the way of the tip, so that now I don't have quite as much sanding to do. Now that tool is as high quality, if not higher quality, than the tools that you had access to in the studio at school, and you made it yourself. The profile of these two tools now, if you notice, are probably similar to the ones we started making in wood. You could still make these out of wood. I still have some small wooden tools that I'll be using throughout the course of the demonstration, but if you have the opportunity to make yourself a couple of metal ones as well, these might be really, really handy in working on refining your designs. The refined tips of those tools, and you can oftentimes do double-ended tools. What I ended up doing is I put some really small chisel heads on one end of the tools, flip them around, and I have some larger trimming heads. Now, these aren't essential, but you may find that the wooden tools, especially when you're getting into these real tight areas, may not be giving you quite the textures you want. I mostly just want to kind of give you guys the option and remind you that we're surrounded by all kinds of these great materials in our homes. Instead of chucking them in the trash, it'd be kind of a fun project to make your own tools. One of the tools I also may reach for at some point are some X-Acto blades, and sometimes I see guys kind of cutting into clay with X-Acto blades with a lot of precision. That's great as long as the clay is dry enough. I wouldn't bring something like a razor blade to the clay unless it was really holding that firm edge. I've got one X-Acto blade that I've kept the tip, and then the other blade I've either nipped or sanded off, ground off. That'll do two different things. Essentially, I turned one of my X-Acto blades into a chisel tip tool. It really just kind of matters about what specific needs you have in your piece and what kind of tools you have laying around. So I'm going to work through this guy and do a few more rounds of refining. One of the first things that I'll do is start to open up holes through the clay. And for that, maybe one of the easiest things would be if you happen to have an old twist bit laying around. If it's a little bit dull, it's even better. What we're really using is not the cutting point, but the sort of fluted edges here that end up cutting away some of that clay. And on my example here, the places that I would like to cut through are in the cracks between each one of these three-sided pieces. Now, if you happen to not have something like a twist bit, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You know, you could potentially use one of those small copper tools to get inside there and actually kind of excavate that out. If you happen to have a small razor blade, you could use a razor blade to carefully excavate that out. Just be careful not to push it through into your finger. If all you have are the tools that are in your kit, I recommend shaping the end of one of your really small sticks here, and while the clay is still reasonably wet, just sort of carefully excavating out those areas. Remember, we're working big to small now, so don't go all the way to the edges of your cut marks just yet. These holes, I'm just going to leave them as drill holes for right now and continue to work around them. Eventually, I'll widen them out to become their actual shape. This small chisel tip tool seems to be working just about as good as the twist bit. And in fact, because of the straight edges on this tool, I'm able to get an even more accurate shape initially, where all the rest of those I'll have to cut out just a little bit more, but good enough for now. At this point in the tutorial, I'm going to pause and bring back a handout that I sent to you in an email. Now, on our very initial carvings, what essentially we were doing was marking into the clay just with a scribing tool, essentially drawing lines into the clay. I still have some of those lines in here. Really, it's just a very, very, very skinny channel drawn in with the edge of a tool. This line here is a good example. Now, that's not a relief carving. Relief carvings are made up of sort of very shallow sculptured reliefs. So imagine if on one side of this divot I removed a bunch of that material, but I removed it in a way that sort of faded it up into the side. Now I'm going to use a technique similar to this. That creates, especially with the rounded edge on one side, that creates a really gradual shadow effect. If you use something that's a little bit more abrupt, a sharp facing corner, that throws a little bit harder shadow. Something that is undercut underneath throws a very, very dark shadow. I'll do some examples in my carving here in a minute to give you an idea. Now, what we want to avoid is thinning out your tile too much. So as you're carving down into your tile, make sure you're not thinning it out so much that that paper thin tile will just snap on you. Your whole tile should basically maintain the same thickness through and through and through. All of the visual effects that make it look like a weaving going under and over are happening on a very small scale. You're not actually removing all the material, you're creating a bit of an illusion. Let me show you how that illusion might work on one of the edges of my pieces here. I'm going to start by basically creating the illusion that this piece is going underneath this piece. I'll start by cutting just a little bit more deeply into the clay so that my initial cut is a bit deeper. This cut is a vertical cut, and now I'm going to come in at a very shallow angle and sort of scallop off a little bit of a piece. Now, almost immediately it starts to kind of create that illusion of it kind of passing underneath. I'm going to scallop off just a little bit more of that material with the razor blade here. And if I didn't have a razor blade, I could use the chisel tip tool and the knife tool. And I'll end up refining the edges of my piece, especially right where those holes are. And today, that's about as far as I think I'll try to get with any of my pieces. I'm going to create sort of a fade here so that this tricorn sort of flows down underneath. So with this example, I've sort of started to bring my image up into relief. It's starting to throw a bit of a shadow. It's not just perfectly flat all the way across. It's sort of dives down into the tile there, but it's really an illusion created by a very small amount of clay removal. Similar to this technique, where I cut down into one side and then slowly tapered it back. it's really not that much carving. It's kind of an interesting technique once you get into it, and you'll end up deciding which tools are your favorite in order to do it. And so I'll work through a few more here just to kind of give you a sense of how long this process might take. So I've got maybe just a little under 10 minutes worth of work into this thing so far, and you can see that it's a little rough, but when I turn it sideways, I'm no longer looking at a perfectly flat tile. Now I'm here maybe at about, I don't know, a third of the way across my whole piece, working towards a piece that's going to have a couple of very specific qualities. So in the corners, right, these are little three-sided corners. I'll end up having to open up all my little circles and get those things. Now I've also got each one of these tiles that sort of dives underneath the next one. So I've got a little bit more carving and some smoothing to do, but that'll probably happen over the next couple of days.